You ever play Jumping Flash? It was developed by Exact, one of the foremost pioneers of 3D platforming who got their start on the Sharp X68000. If you aren't familiar with this machine, it's because it was very much exclusive to Japan, and along with it came a little-known title by the name of Geograph Seal. With its almost Star Fox-esque graphics, this romp saw players controlling a mech with gameplay that consists of shooting and platforming. And while it would go on to receive a bit of recognition from critics, it fell to the wayside thanks to releasing in 1994, which was so late into the X68000's lifespan that the machine itself had been discontinued a year prior. However, Exact knew that they'd made something special, so taking everything they'd learned while developing Geograph Seal, they created a tech demo for the then yet to be released PlayStation called Springman. And something about it must have appealed to Sony because their very own Japan studio, along with Ultra, assisted Exact in developing what would become Jumping Flash. This is one of those early PS1 games that true OGs remember. Either you first played it on a demo disc, or picked it up along with the launch PS1 in Europe, or who knows, maybe fate itself smiled upon your existence and you just wound up with it. Anyway, Jumping Flash is all about a big ol' mechanical bunny named Robbit. After the dastardly Baron Aloha starts taking chunks from the aptly named Crater Planet, the Universal City Hall sends him in to save the day by retrieving jet pods, defeating bosses, and thwarting Aloha himself. It's a concept that is beyond odd, but it is original. And back in the 5th gen, being bombastic was all the rage, with Sony themselves hoping beyond hope that Robbit would attain the same status as Mario and Sonic. But Jumping Flash isn't anything like those series. It's all about running around in first person while you shoot stuff and leap incredibly high. You move around with the D-pad, and as unappealing as that may sound, there are two very good reasons for it. The first being that this game released not only before the DualShock existed, but before the first analog stick had even hit the market. It actually predates Mario 64 by a little over a year, so there was nothing set in stone for 3D games at all, which happens to correlate with the second point in that Robbit controls like a tank. I find this type of scheme to be very hit and miss in platformers, with games like Tomb Raider being clear successes and others like Croc 1 playing a little rough. But in the case of Jumping Flash, it makes total sense. And it really helps that it isn't a third-person game. It's actually a lot like Metroid Prime, which may or may not be very high praise. And much like Samus, Robbit can free aim with shoulder buttons and is also capable of springing to incredible heights with a ridiculous triple jump that lets you clear large gaps with ease. It's not the most involved platforming, with only a few instances of having to time your jumps, but it isn't horrible. And kudos to whoever had the idea of the camera panning down so you can see if you're gonna land or not. I know there are some out there who find this to be awkward, and yeah, I can understand why, but isn't seeing whether or not you're about to fall to your death important? This is also the only time in the game you can strafe, as instead of turning left and right, you're shifted left and right. But the lack of being able to otherwise doesn't hurt things too greatly. Robbit is an incredibly overpowered character with pickups like Roman candles and cherry bombs that are able to clear the screen of any enemies. Pair that with these pills, vitamins, that grant invincibility, and it's a lot less of a challenge and more of a power trip. You're given so much to dominate everything that our hero goes from being a sort of space mall cop to a straight-up Terminator, and that kinda carries over to all other aspects. Platforming itself is a lot less about precision and more so vertical progression, with levels themselves being considerably small. There are actually two types to be found: open exploration-based romps, which make up most of the game, and linear maze-like dungeons with a greater emphasis on shooting. Within each are 4 jet pods, which when collected activate the exit, with stage 1 of every world also having a bonus zone that allows you to rack up extra points and score a free 1-up. This all factors into the in-level tally, which takes into account damage and time spent, as well as coins picked up, though aside from going for a high score, there isn't very much incentive. As you might expect, reaching the end of a world sees you going up against one of Aloha's many lackeys, with such bosses as dragons, scorpions, and even an evil version of Robbit, who are all so incompetent you can defeat them in less than a minute by just jumping on their heads and shooting at them. All in all, it's about as straightforward as you can get, being perhaps the most beginner-friendly 3D platformer, which is appropriate when you remember exactly when it released. Only, it never manages to progress any further. Aside from the overall charm and catchy music, there isn't very much to keep you coming back, though that didn't stop them from trying. Completing the game once unlocks Extra Mode, which is essentially a remix of things that changes jetpod locations with a stricter clock. And if that wasn't enough, there are also Super and Hyper modes, which allow you to run through the levels yet again with an even more ridiculous sextuple jump, that is 6 jumps back to back, along with being able to sprint and even speed up your fall so Robbit can mercilessly squash the ever-loving shit out of anything underfoot. As if he wasn't already a hopping death machine, this manages to make him infinitely more lethal with even less of a challenge present. You can straight up fly around and beat levels in like 20 seconds. I wish I was kidding. The most pushback you run into is on account of the draw distance. There's a radar, sure, but this can make finding the jet pods a bit of a pain since, aside from picking up a time stopper, you've got to be pretty close to see them. And in levels like this with all these coaster tracks, you can very easily get turned around. That aside, the game is just wacky enough to stand on its own 2 feet. There's the premise, which is insane, but with the almost dreamlike environments and enemies that include the likes of giraffes, moths, and frogs, you'll be hard-pressed to find another game like it. But did Jumping Flash attain the level of runaway success Sony was gunning for? Not quite. The game was received well by critics and would even cultivate a bit of a following, but its status as the greatest 3D platformer ever made was short-lived, as less than a year later, Super Mario 64 would hit the market, followed by the avalanche of other all-time greats. For exact, it was Geograph Seal all over again. Only the PlayStation wasn't a dead console, and room for growth was still abundant. So, along with Ultra, who'd rebranded to MuuMuu, they developed and released Jumping Flash 2 the next year. Following his defeat, Baron Aloha has fled to the planet of Little Moo, where we not only meet the lovable MuuMuus, but also Captain Kabuki. Taking a page out of the last game, Little Moo is broken into chunks, with the $6 million bunny himself returning to put things back together. Being a sequel, there's a lot of carryover from before with the same gameplay and visual style, though there are also a few big improvements in regards to the draw distance, amount of power-ups that can be held, and enemy AI. Rather than collecting jet pods, the big MacGuffin this time is the MuuMuus themselves, with each level having 4 to scoop up. There are also a few new weapons like laser beams, but perhaps the biggest innovation here is none other than the performance medals, which are an honest-to-God achievement system based around completing tasks. You've got the basic ones, like clearing a level without any damage or beating the extra mode, but there are a great many arbitrary ones, like spamming all of your fireworks or killing every enemy type, and a lot of the same issues are present. The game is incredibly short, with as little replay value as before, and despite their best attempt at sprucing the enemies up, the same cannot be said about the bosses, whose kryptonite remains the pesky combo of being jumped on and shot at. There also wasn't very much done to facilitate a more intuitive gameplay experience. It truly is the same as before, with no attempts made at refining anything. I can understand a lack of analog since this too released in the days of the D-pad, but what is up with the lack of strafing? Did they somehow forget the controller had 4 shoulder buttons? Jesus Christ, Star Fox 2 did it with 2! That said, if you truly didn't get enough from the first game, this is guaranteed to scratch that itch, with a lot of the same whimsy thanks to its consistent style and admittedly great soundtrack. For everyone else, it's just kinda weak. But don't go thinking that it's at the bottom of the proverbial totem pole, as up next, we have Pocket MuuMuu. This is the first of 2 games released exclusively in Japan, and the sole title to take advantage of the Pocket Station. It's also the only game to deviate from the platforming formula, as the majority of its focus is centered around mini-games that can be played on either the PlayStation or Pocket Station itself. But how do you get the mini-games? You gotta buy them. How do you get the money to buy them? By playing them. It all boils down to a vicious cycle in which the stupid grind out getting 3 stars in every game, and the intelligent stick to the one that pays the most. Also known as the strategy I created and may never be duplicated without my express permission. You've got the standard games like Breakout, Image Matching, and Golf, but then there are these really dumb ones like this Gravatar clone. It starts out with a button mashing sequence, which I can only imagine is pure hell on a Pocket Station. I'd probably crush the fucking thing, before transitioning to this aimless space stage. I gave this multiple tries, and even still, I can't figure out what the hell I have to do, since the moment I start to make any progress, I get killed. Aside from games, your money can also be spent on stuff to build an amusement park with the ultimate goal of a roller coaster. But I've got to be honest, I didn't play this game anywhere near the time required to do that, and I can only spend so much time finger-banging the controller to win at games like this sumo one here. It should also be noted that a lot of this game's difficulty and overall mystery is thanks to the fact that it's all in Japanese. As I said before, this game never made it to the West, and neither did the Pocket Station, but when the thing is remembered most for being used with the horrible Japanese release of Spyro, I don't think we missed out on anything too important. Speaking of missing out, we have Robbit Mon Dieu, which despite its French title, never left the land of the rising sun. While not officially titled as such, this is the closest thing to Jumping Flash 3 there is, only instead of returning to the original formula, it embraces a non-linear mission-based approach. Since the defeat of both Aloha and Kabuki, Robbit has been elevated to the status of Galactic Defender, and when the citizens of planet Hananuma cry out for help, he's there to save the day, all like, but if you're expecting anything grand, let me tell ya, this isn't that kind of game. Whereas Jumping Flash 1 and 2 are all about piecing worlds together by means of running and gunning, here Robbit wears many hats, such as babysitter, ghostbuster, and plumber. That isn't to say it's devoid of the series' trappings, what with a good amount of jumping high and shooting at things, but no longer is he the killing machine he once was. He's actually a lot more like a nanny, making sure nobody gets themselves killed. And wouldn't you know it, still no analog despite releasing in late 1999. It really seems like Exact, known by this time as Sugar and Rockets, were more interested in evolving the gameplay itself rather than the way of playing the game. Which is why I can only surmise strafing is still nowhere to be found, but hey, at least they added cards and made it so Robbit can speed up his falling by default. Overall, it's a clear step forward, but is handled far too safe, with a resulting product that's just kinda lukewarm. I guess that's my nice way of saying that it's mediocre, and by this point, we'd seen some of the most impressive 3D platformers to grace the 5th gen. So for this to be almost identical to games that were already behind the curve, it doesn't do it any favors. But that begs an important question. If by some crazy circumstance Sony was to give Jumping Flash another chance, what could they do? Obviously, they could spring for an updated take, or God forbid a remake, but the idea I see tossed around the most, and the one I'm personally fond of, is a VR game. Sure, that'd appeal to an even smaller audience and would almost certainly result in motion sickness, but to be able to actually pilot Robbit with his insane arsenal and ridiculous jumping skills would at the very least be interesting. Maybe have it all culminate in a battle between Robbit and Astro to see who's the better PlayStation robot. You know what else is interesting? The fact that you can play Jumping Flash 1 and 2 within a browser on the Internet Archive. Yeah, there are a lot of ways you can emulate these games. You can even pay to do so on PS4 and 5, but something about this feels right. An unorthodox way of playing an unorthodox duo of games that in an alternate timeline might have set the standard had Nintendo somehow fucked up the order with Super Mario 64. Gotta love it.